Thank you for that applause. I'll wait till it dies down and we'll begin. And we should be getting some slides up there really soon. My name is Hernandez. I am the Apologetics lead for Texas Baptist. You may be asking, what is apologetics? We will touch on that today, this morning. As they're getting that situated, I'll go ahead and take the opportunity really quick. What I'll be talking about is the role of apologetics in spiritual warfare and evangelism. Fair warning, I do talk fast because I do have ADHD. The medicine does help. Thank you for laughing at my mental disorder. But what we'll be talking about today is actually on DVD. It's Spiritual Warfare of Our Culture, which we have back there. And we'll be touching a little bit on the other DVD, Evidence for God. I've often, when I've go to places, especially with young people, I've often given it away. So while you may see a price on there, if you don't have the money or would just like one, please let me know. We also have download cards that are available. It's up there. And I don't see it here. But what you can also take, if you would like, for free is there's a magazine, and in it I was interviewed for an article on evangelism, and you can go back there and take one for absolutely free if you want to learn more about what we do. And I want to be transparent. All proceeds from today will go to feed a hungry family. My hungry family, I have 2 young kids. My youngest is 3, and he is growing quite fast. So let's jump into this. Usually, I like to start by reading a verse from the Bible, but I want to start this morning by reading from an atheist Bible, if you will. I say that kind of tongue-in-cheek. Anybody know who this man is? Richard Dawkins. He's one of the most, if not the most popular atheist today. He wrote a book called The God Delusion. Here's a famous quote from his book. He says, "The God of the Old Testament is unarguably the most unpleasant character in all fiction. He is jealous and proud of it. He is a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic, racist, infanticidal, genocidal, philicidential, pestilential, megalomaniacal, sadomasochistic, capricious, malevolent bully." What do you think? How does that make you feel? Him saying these really nasty things about the God that you and I just got through worshiping. But my next question is, how would you respond? Now, while there's a lot that could be said here, I can recommend a really good book, Is God a Moral Monster, by Christian philosopher Paul Copan, who deals with all these issues and more. But I'm reminded of something Christ said. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 13, he says something really interesting. He says, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its purpose, it is no longer good for anything but to be thrown out and walked on by men." Now, because of the technological gap between today and when this was written, we often lose these idioms or analogies. So to understand what Christ is getting at, you have to first understand that in these times there were no refrigerators, obviously. So as a way to preserve meat, they would add salt to meat and various aspects of meat, and it would be a way to keep meat from spoiling. So with this in mind, understand what he's saying here. Biblically speaking, who is the salt of the earth? Us. The meat would be indicative of the world, the culture that we live in. Let me ask you this morning, is the meat going bad? Absolutely. Look at the laws that are being put forth. Look at turn on social media. Look at the news. Absolutely, the meat is going bad. Which brings us to the point that Christ is making. See, imagine if you lived in these times and you had this bag of salt at home, and you would add this to meat that you would buy at the market, but you notice that no matter how much salt you add or what type of meat it was, it continued to spoil and go bad, and it was not preserved 1 minute longer. When this happens, at some point you're going to have to step back and stop asking what's wrong with the meat, and at some point you're going to have to ask yourself, what's wrong with the salt? I have 2 questions for you. When people ask me, what is apologetics? There's 2 questions I always like to ask. First is, why are you a Christian? This is the easiest way I know how to explain it. And the second is, why should someone else be a Christian? Because notice that your answer to the first question may not necessarily apply to the second. There's a lot I could say on this. I'm currently in the process of writing a book for Texas Baptists on witnessing to non-believers. But one of the things that I address there is, if I can say this, oftentimes we pitch evangelism as a way of fulfilling someone's personal felt needs and self-interest. As if become a Christian because look at what God did for me and he can do it for you. And now the gospel is no longer centered around who Christ is, but who and what Christ can do for you to fill my needs. I've heard many answers to this question, but what I usually get is people would typically share a testimony with me. And don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with your testimony, but let me put it this way. I was speaking at a men's conference once, and one of the speakers of this conference wasn't the pastor of the church, but he approached me later, or rather before the conference started, he approached me, and in a kind of condescending way said, "So you do apologetics, is that right?" I said, "Yeah." This was years ago. I won't mention the church, but if you meet me afterwards outside, and maybe I'll, thank you, tough crowd. Okay, so he said, "So you do apologetics?" He says, "Well, you know what they say. A man with an experience is never at the mercy of a man with an argument." I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "Well, I have my testimony of how God changed me and saved my life, so I don't need apologetics, which we'll define shortly as defending the faith. I don't need that. I have my testimony." I once heard someone say, if someone tells you they don't need apologetics, they just revealed to you how little evangelism they actually do. So I said, "Do you do any evangelism?" He said, "I do, absolutely." I said, "What do you do?" He says, "Once a month, my church goes to these apartments where we're at, and we set up this station in the area. We interact with the community. We cook hot dogs and hamburgers for the kids. We play basketball with them. We talk with them. It's great. And then I stand up and I share my testimony. Because, see, I was addicted to drugs. I was in gangs. I was violent. I was going through a divorce. I was an alcoholic. But God changed my life. And because of my experience and testimony, no one can argue against that." I said, "Okay." I said, "Well, I have a question for you. So you go for lunch. Let's suppose, hypothetically, you go for lunch. Let's say some hours later that evening, another religious group comes, but let's say they're Muslim. And they come to the same location, and they set up an area and a station, and they interact with the community, and they cook hot dogs and hamburgers for everyone, and they play basketball with the kids. But suppose one of their religious leaders stands up, and for the sake of the argument, let's say his testimony was like 10 times better than your testimony, right? Let's say he was in 10 different gangs, addicted to 10 different drugs, going through 10 different divorces, had 10 bottles of alcohol at his house. But then he stood up and said, "But the one true God changed my life, and his name is Allah." I said, "Now, based on what you told me, that's his experience, which no one can argue with. So based on his testimony, I'm curious, would you become a Muslim?" He said, "No, of course not." I said, "Right." Now, there's lots more examples I'd love to share, but for the sake of time, here's what I would say. Because, see, even if his testimony, while a great one, answers the first question, it doesn't answer the second. But if someone asks me, "Eric, why are you a Christian? Why should someone else be a Christian?" Here's my answer. You ready for it? Because it's true. Novel thought, right? In other words, my salvation or who God is and who Christ is not predicated on me or my life, but rather that it is simply true, that historically speaking, Christ rose from the dead, and we know that God exists. Note how the shift has changed here. Because growing up, I would see in my youth group, we'd go to camp and get on fire for God, whatever that meant, and 2 weeks later, I guess the fire would leave, and in some of my peers' mind, I guess, so did their salvation, and it seemed as if their salvation was based on an emotional experience, so when the emotion leaves, perhaps so does my salvation, so every week we're answering the altar call just in case. But note that if Christianity is not based on me or who I am, but based on the truth of God and who He is, then it doesn't matter how I feel. It doesn't matter what experiences I may have. It doesn't matter if God forbid, something happens in my life. If I'm coming to church and on my way I get in an argument with my wife, which has happened like maybe once, twice, I'm not sure, not too much. God is still who He is. Now, 1 Peter 3:15 is usually the go-to verse, because it says to be ready, set Christ in your heart, and be ready to give a logical defense to anyone who asks you to account for the hope that is in you. When someone approaches you, biblically speaking, the Bible is commanding us to give an answer. And if you look in the Greek, that word literally means, the Greek word is apologia, which literally means a defense, and hence, apologetics is given a defense for what we believe. Now, with this in mind, if you're taking notes, write down the word stronghold. This passage is a passage regarding spiritual warfare. And in it, it says, in this verse, that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but are mighty for the pulling down or destroying or tearing down of strongholds. Which means, biblically speaking, according to this passage, when it comes to spiritual warfare, our purpose in it is to tear and pull down strongholds. Now the next question becomes, what's a stronghold? Well, it's actually defined in the next verse, as it says, we refute and tear down arguments, reasonings, every high and proud thing that sets itself up against the knowledge of God. So essentially, we can say that, biblically speaking, a stronghold are things like thoughts, ideas, ideologies, philosophies, any of these set of beliefs that go against the knowledge of God. And this is literally the spiritual warfare of our culture, because a person cannot come to knowledge of God or a deeper knowledge of God with such strongholds. Which means if spiritual warfare encompasses tearing down these false ideologies and beliefs, then it would follow that if you want to be effective in evangelism, if you want to be effective in spiritual warfare and discipleship, then you cannot do so without apologetics. And if you disagree, you can take that up with the author. I just read the book. I didn't write it. But according to Scripture, this is what we're told. Now again, while there's much more to be said, there are three dominant strongholds in our culture that I want to briefly go over, and with the time we have left, briefly address. Because I can assure you, men like Richard Dawkins are the ones who are influencing the culture, influencing the university. In fact, I'll even show you, if time permits, how some of these strongholds we'll see have crept into the church and we have not even realized it. Now, before I do, though, you might think, but Eric, isn't it just all about faith? I don't have time to get into that, because I'd say that word has been quite misapplied and abused from all sides. But let's look at this. They approached Christ, and they said, out of all the commandments in the Old Testament, which one is the greatest? How many commandments are in the Old Testament? Usually people say 10, and I say close enough. 613, but 10, it's pretty close. And he said, out of all 613, the greatest is to love the Lord God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. Can I say that the modern day church, not this church or that church, just the modern day American 21st century church, I think we do a fair job of loving God with our strength. What does that mean? It's your service towards God. We bring the casseroles to the potlucks, right? We pull out chairs and tables for youth group, and we serve God with our strength, and that is fantastic. And then there's loving God with a heart, which is where they believe the seat of the emotions were, and we get emotional at the altar, we cry out to God, and that is great. But then there's loving God with a mind. And can I say, and the statistics do show, that this is where the modern day 21st century American church has really dropped the ball. Because see, it hasn't always been this way. If you were to look in church history, let's go back 2,000 years or so, around 300 AD, and look at some of the church fathers as they gathered together around for the Council of Nicaea. And they began to hammer out the doctrine of the Trinity, because heresies began to arise when it came to who Christ was. And there's lots to say there, but they began to discuss these things and hammer in detail these out, because you have to understand, Christianity was still a relatively new religion at this time. And there were some false things being said or inaccurate things that were being said. So they said, let's get on the same page. Because if we're going to give our lives for this stuff, which they were, we had better be sure that what we're saying is true, that it is biblically accurate, and note further, philosophically consistent and logically coherent. So they begin to ask questions like, how can we express this? Well, we can say that there is one what, but three whos. Okay, what about Christ? Well, he was divine, but he was human. Well, we can say that while he had a divine nature, he took on a human nature. What does it mean to have a nature? What are the metaphysical implications of a nature? And as they begin to discuss these things, you have to understand that around this time, the church had seen the greatest type of persecution throughout the history of the church, where they're being fed to lions, burned alive, crucified upside down, stoned to death, boiled to death, hung and just burned at the stake. And yet their greatest concern around this time is what we believe true. Now fast forward with me 2,000 years later. And ask ourselves, what is our greatest concern? Are the church pews comfortable enough? Did they sing my favorite song? Did the pastor wear the right suit and tie? Because we're not being fed to lions. We're not being persecuted for our faith. But what's our greatest concern? I was invited once to speak at this church to the youth group, not by the pastor, by someone else, but the pastor asked if I could have lunch with him before the service, so we did. And he said, so, you know, I know you do apologetics, and that's great and all, but I just don't think it has a place behind the pulpit. Maybe for a Bible study, but definitely not something like a Sunday morning. Well, thankfully, I wasn't going to speak on apologetics that evening, but I said, okay, I wasn't going to argue with him. He's a pastor, after all. I'm not going to get into a fight with the pastor, if you will, prior to the service. So when I spoke that evening, as I introduced myself, I briefly mentioned apologetics, and I said, if you have questions on that, look for me after the service. At the conclusion of the service, as I'm gathering my things, this young man with his mom make a beeline straight towards me, and they stop like right in front of me. And he looks at me and says, tell her you said we could ask you questions, right? And I thought, my goodness, what did I say? Did I say something wrong in the sermon? Was I off somewhere? And I said, yeah. And she looks at him, and she looks at me and says, well, if you're okay with it, I'll let y'all talk. And she walked off. I said, what was that about? He looked at me and says, well, I'm an atheist. I don't want to come to church, but my mom forces me to, so I come. But I had questions. And as I began to ask the peers in my youth group these questions, they were troubled or couldn't answer them, so I asked the youth pastor, and the same thing, and I asked the pastor. And it got to the point to where they pretty much told me, if you're going to come to church, sit down, be quiet, and stop asking questions. You are no longer allowed to ask anyone in this church questions. But then he looked at me, and he said, but you don't come here. So you're an exception. And you said we could ask you questions, right? So can I ask you questions? We talked for the next hour at least, to the point to where the person with the keys to the church said, I have to lock up. You guys have to leave. So I said, look, I'd love to continue the conversation. Sharp kid, by the way. And I said, no kid your age understands these things like you do. What books are you reading? Sure enough, Richard Dawkins was one of them that I mentioned earlier. A few other popular atheists. And I said, look, I'll talk to I'm having breakfast with Pastor tomorrow. I'll give him my information. And if he's okay with it, I'd love to continue the conversation. I met with the pastor for breakfast, and I said, you know you have an atheist in your youth group. And he kind of laughed nervously, and he looked at his plate and said, yeah, that's so-and-so. We're praying for him. I said, you know it's going to take more than that. This is a small town in Texas. If you lose him, he's going to take about half those kids with him. I encourage you to reconsider what we talked about yesterday. I said, but here's my card, here's my information. Out of respect for you in the church, I told him I would give it to you. If you're okay with it, would you please hand it to him? This was at least 8 years ago. I never heard from that kid. Don't know if he got it. But you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its purpose, it's no longer good for anything. What are the three strongholds? I don't have much time left. And apparently that wants to flicker. Is that still connected? Did I move something? You can just talk awkwardly amongst yourselves. Maybe just unplug and replug the, on the right side, I think is where I put it. Oh, there we go. Excellent. Okay. So there are three dominant strongholds. We're going to go through them very quickly. And again, I go into more detail in the DVD. First one is known as relativism or postmodernism. What is it? It is a view that there is no truth, or truth is relative, there is no absolute truth. If I said there's a dog to the right of this podium, and a sister in front of me said, no, there's a dog to the left of the podium, who's right and who's wrong? Well, we're both right. And in the same way, when it comes to religion or what you choose to believe, or whether it comes to your gender or sexual orientation or the question of abortion, something can be true for you but not for me. So excuse me, Mr. or Mrs. Christian, don't impose your religious, bigoted, closed-minded morality onto me, thank you very much, because truth is relative. There is no absolute truth, and we can't ever claim, or you can't claim, that Christianity is true. The stronghold. The second one is known as Scientism. Again, always lots to say, but it could be summed up by the belief that science is the best way to gain knowledge about anything, or the only way. So someone may say, if you want me to believe in God, show me the scientific evidence. I saw a meme the other day that clearly expressed the influence of this in our culture, and the meme said, scientists have recently discovered that people will believe anything you say as long as you say scientists have recently discovered it. And it's quite true. Or they might say if it can't be proven scientifically, then either it cannot be known or cannot be true. Now this last one really hits home for me, naturalism. It is a view that the physical world is all that exists, nothing more, nothing less. Again, I know I'm going through this fast, but I will stick around and take questions if you like. Here's why this one hit home for me. Freshman year of college, I took my first philosophy class. Later found out my professor was an atheist, but I learned a lot in that class. And when I wanted to take my next class, everyone warned me not to take this particular professor because he was an atheist, but his goal was to make you lose your faith. And my reaction was, where do I sign up? Not because I wanted to, but I was genuinely curious. And I knew enough, and I was raised to know, that if Christianity is true, I need to know why. But if it's false, I'd still like to know why, and perhaps this is a guy for the job. So here is a pivotal day in class that shifted and put me on the path that I am here and am on now today. He walks in, and he pretends like he pulls out this antidepressant pill from his pocket. And he says, religion wants us to believe in something like a soul. And because of this, allegedly, we have hope in an afterlife, and according to Christianity, we can see our family and friends when we pass away. And according to this, your thoughts and your moods and your feelings and emotions are in your soul. But here's the problem. He held up the pill and said, if I were to take this pill, which is physical, it has the ability to affect the allegedly immaterial states and moods and feelings of my soul. But how can something physical and tiny affect the alleged immaterial soul? Because every time we look at brain scans, all we see are neurons firing, and every time we look at the body, we just see the chemicals and the elements, but you don't find anything like a soul. How do we explain this? He said, I'll tell you how. It's simple. The answer is that there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell, there is no God, there's no afterlife. You're just a physical brain and body, a meat machine, and we need to learn to live with this fact and get on with our lives and stop believing in these foolish fairy tales. Class dismissed. Stronghold. Now, at this point in my life, I had heard a lot of people offer complaints against Christianity, but it wouldn't mean that even if their complaints were true, wouldn't mean Christianity is false. A Christian can be a hypocrite, but a Christian who's a hypocrite doesn't mean God does not exist. But here was for the first time in my life I had heard an argument that, if true, would mean Christianity was false. How so? Paul says, if there is no resurrection, our hope is in vain, our faith is useless, and people should actually feel sorry for how dumb and gullible we are. But if the resurrection is true, then we have the hope, and Christ rose from the dead. But see, by the same line of logic, if there's no soul, there can be no resurrection, and once again, if there's no soul and no resurrection, Christianity would be false. How would you respond? Stronghold. Well, thank you for your time. I'm sorry I couldn't get to the answers. Maybe we can go later. You can grab the DVD. A tough crowd, I know. I'm just joking. We'll briefly run through them. So, let's go to the first one. There is no truth. I once had a lady come up to me and say, you can't say Christianity is true because there is no truth. I said, let me ask you a question. Is that true? Because if you tell me there is no truth, but what you just asserted, it seems that you believe is true. But if there is no truth, then the very statement, there is no truth, can't be true to begin with. So what am I missing here? That's what you call self-defeating. I was invited once on a secular liberal radio station, and they said, we want to invite people from the community to talk about their beliefs. You know, we're on the other side, so to speak, here, but we want to show everybody how tolerant we are, and we want to invite you on the show. Now, a lot of people listen in, but we don't always get people to call in unless they find what you say interesting or challenging. So would you like to come on and take some calls? I said, sure. Now, I was going to present for some time and then take calls, but as we began, about 10 minutes into my presentation, the host looks at me and stops me and says, I know you're not even halfway through yet, but all the phone lines are ringing. Would you like to take a call? I said, sure. First guy calls in and basically says, who are you to tell people they're wrong? I said, excuse me? He said, who are you to tell people they're wrong? Are you willing to admit that you think that anyone who's not a Christian and all these other religions are wrong? I said, yeah. Yeah, that's how it works. He said, but who are you to tell people they're wrong? I said, well, hold on, let me see if I get you straight. Are you telling me that we shouldn't tell people they're wrong? Is that what you're saying? He said, yes, you can't tell someone they're wrong. Okay, and do you think this is an inappropriate thing to do? He said, yes. I said, okay. Well, then I just have one question. Why are you calling me on a live public radio to tell me that I'm wrong, if it's wrong to tell people they're wrong? He didn't have any more questions after that. I went to the next caller. One lady said, Christians are so intolerant. I said, hold on, ma'am. Are you saying that we should tolerate everyone's beliefs? She said, yes. Okay. Well, then, can I ask, why are you not tolerating my beliefs and my alleged intolerance? All right, again, these are self-defeating. Moving on. Scientism, lots to say, but suffice to say it's false. Let me say this, just for the sake of time. First of all, if an atheist were to ask me, Eric, can you give me scientific evidence for God? My response is, why would I want to do a silly thing like that? He says, what do you mean? I said, well, science, it's a wonderful tool for studying the physical, natural world, but God, if he exists, is by definition a non-physical being. So while science can study the physical, it has absolutely nothing to say about the non-physical. It is a category fallacy. It would be like, imagine if your friend grabbed a metal detector, went to the beach, and an hour later comes back and says, you know, I found a lot of metal, but you know what else I discovered? There's no plastic on the beach. And you turn around and you see it's littered with plastic. And you say, what do you mean? And he says, well, I took this metal detector here, and it detected lots of metal, but it found no plastic. So there's no plastic. The irony, of course, is that his metal detector is made almost entirely of plastic. But you say, well, of course it didn't detect any plastic. It's a metal detector, not a plastic detector. So when an atheist asks me to provide scientific evidence for God, they're using metal detectors to try and look for plastic. Because again, if he's non-physical, why would you expect something that can only study the physical to investigate the immaterial? It's a category fallacy. Also, this is also self-defeating. Briefly, if someone says, I can only believe what science tells me, my response is, well, wait a minute, what scientific test told you that you could only believe what science tells you? Because it sounds like what you're saying is not a scientific statement, it's a philosophical statement about science. But if your statement is philosophical and non-scientific, then the statement, I can only believe what science tells me, according to your standards, you shouldn't believe it because it is not something science told you. That is philosophy, not science. So if you can only believe what science tells you, then you shouldn't only believe what science tells you because that's not science, that's philosophy. Now this one, really quick, soul thing, and I'll end here. Let me touch quickly on the soul. There's lots to say, but suffice it to say that because of him, this is now the area that I most specialize and have focused on. In fact, has anyone seen the movie God's Not Dead? Anyone? Yeah? I don't like that movie, but it's the same principle where 5 years after I graduated, he was actually my first public formal one-on-one debate on the existence of God. It wasn't even at my church. Someone else set it up. Again, a long story. But after that, I approached him and I said, I don't know what you're going to think about this because I know you're an atheist. But I just really want to thank you for allowing God to use you in my life the way he did. Because if it weren't for you, I wouldn't be where I'm at today. In fact, the car that I now drive is a Kia Soul because it makes for a good joke when I teach on the soul. But really quick, what he's basically saying is the mind is the same thing as the brain. Remember I told you that these strongholds have influenced the church and we haven't realized it? Quick experiment. Can you point to me, please? Point to what part of your body thinks. Can you point? Okay, I see a lot of this. Brain. Your brain thinks. Someone says heart. Brain or heart. Do you need a brain to think? Yeah? Okay, next question. Does God have a brain? Sorry. We're not at a Mormon church, are we? No. No, God does not have a brain. Those who worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. God's spirit. He's not physical. He didn't have a brain. Hey, does God think? Yeah. Psalmist says that his thoughts towards me and you are more than the grains of sand. He thinks. If you need a brain to think, God doesn't think. He thinks. Hey, are you made in his image? Hey, do you need a brain to think? Here's a conundrum here. We live in a society, in a culture, that tells us your brain thinks. Why? Because we want to be neutral. We don't want to bring any soul, spirit, spookiness into the mix. So we know that when you think, there's neurological activity. So let's say that it's your brain that thinks and be neutral. That's not neutral. That's naturalism. But we live in a culture that tells us it is your brain that thinks, so we believe our brain thinks, and then we come Sunday morning and we worship a God that has no brain and thinks just fine, but we never let these two beliefs come together, because if they do, we're going to be in trouble. And it's not the culture, it's not the church driving the culture, it's the culture driving the church. Strongholds. Really quick on soul. One argument I use for the soul, because I can talk hours for this, I won't, you're welcome. But if there is no soul, then whatever the mind is should be nothing more than the brain. But we know that's not true. Why? Because there are things true of the mind that are not true of the brain. I'll give you 3 quick examples. Take a state of my mind and a state of my brain. My mind can contain thoughts, and my thoughts can be true or false. But my brain or my neurons aren't true or false. It doesn't even make sense to say. My brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. While we may be having heavy thoughts right now, we're not going to go buy a neck brace after this is over. My brain can be 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana is not 7 inches long. And I can give you plenty of examples more, but the point is simple. If all the properties of the brain are physical, and all the properties of the mind are not physical, then it follows that if consciousness exists, it can't be physical. And if it can't be physical, naturalism can't be true. So if you're conscious, you shouldn't be an atheist, because you now have something immaterial that exists. Again, lots more to say, but I'll leave you with this. Here's a really great argument for God's existence. Don't worry about the big name, but it takes 30 seconds to share. So if you're in a taxi cab, in an elevator, if you follow someone into the bathroom and they sit down, you've got at least 30 seconds, and you can get your witness in there. It's 3 premises, which are just statements. First, everything that begins to exist has a cause. Universe began to exist. Therefore, universe has a cause. This is from Evidence of God. I unpack that much deeper there, but briefly. Here's how we know this. To understand the argument, when the universe began, three things came into existence: time, space, and matter. Now, if there were no universe, in other words, we can put it this way, there would be no time, no space, and no matter. Now, when we look back at the argument, we're going to unpack the attributes of this cause. Here's why. Whoever caused my phone to exist is not inside it, making it work, because causes come before and are external to their effects. You with me? Now, if the universe began and had a cause, then whatever the cause of the universe must have also been the cause of time, space, and matter. And if causes proceed and are external to their effects, then it follows that the cause of time, space, and matter must have been what? Timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Does that sound familiar to you? So we can say, if the universe began to exist, there at least must be something that exists that was timeless, spaceless, and immaterial. Now, I've had atheists say, well, why God, though? Why would you posit, why couldn't it be something natural? And I say, well, because if you're telling me that something natural created everything and all of nature, then you're essentially saying that nature existed prior to its existence in order to bring itself into existence, and that's a logical contradiction. So if nature had a beginning, you must need something that is beyond the natural, that is beyond nature, something like, there's a word for that, supernatural. So now you have a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, supernatural, and we can say unimaginably powerful. Why? Creation out of nothing. Personal. Why? Again, to be brief, because the universe isn't necessary. It didn't have to exist. So a decision was made. Decisions come from wills. Wills are grounded in minds, and we know minds come from persons. So, deep breath. If the universe began to exist, and I've written this down on a napkin before plenty of times and just handed it to someone in conversation. If the universe began to exist, deep breath, there must be then a timeless, spaceless, immaterial, supernatural, unimaginably powerful, personal being, and I just call him God for short. And I have the privilege of calling him my Heavenly Father. And so do you. I end with, you are the salt of the earth. But if the salt loses its purpose, it's not good for anything. You can find more of my stuff on YouTube. I have some debates on there. Some other stuff I have back there, also debates I've done with other people, professors, including a 2-hour debate on the soul. And if you want the notes from today, you can go to this website, you can take a picture of it, and you can actually get my slides that I use, plus some other stuff and some notes for free, if you would like. With that said, again, you are the salt of the earth. I encourage you, love people, show love, share Christ, and let's be the salt. Amen? Thank you.